The summer days grew shorter, but the tension that hung over us seemed infinite, stretched thin like a fragile wire ready to snap. Gatsby, steadfast in his devotion to Daisy, clung to the belief that their love could somehow erase the past. He waited for her signal, a word, a gesture, anything that would prove she was ready to leave Tom for good. But the days ticked by, and no such sign came. After Myrtle Wilson's death, the atmosphere in West Egg and East Egg changed. Gossip rippled through every cocktail party and dinner table, fueled by whispered accounts of the tragedy. The details were fuzzy. Some claimed the yellow car had been driven by a stranger. Others speculated about Daisy or even Gatsby himself, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was scandalous. Gatsby, however, had no interest in clearing his name. He was consumed by one concern: Daisy's well-being. He refused to leave his mansion, convinced she would call or appear at any moment. I spent much of my time at his house, keeping him company and listening to him recount, again and again, the moments he and Daisy had shared before her marriage to Tom. She loved me, he insisted, his voice heavy with conviction. It was real. She loved me then, and she still does. I didn't have the heart to argue, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince me or himself. The morning after Myrtle's death, I found Gatsby standing at the edge of his pool, staring into the still water as though it held the answers to all his questions. The weather had cooled overnight. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. I waited all night, he said without looking at me. She didn't call. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The reality was too obvious and too cruel. Daisy wasn't coming. She had retreated to her mansion in East Egg with Tom, closing the gates behind her, leaving Gatsby on the other side. She'll call today, he added, as though reading my mind. She has to. But the hours passed, and the phone remained silent. Gatsby tried to distract himself by giving instructions to his staff. His energy was frantic, restless. He sent the butler to check the mail 3 times before noon and called the gardener to discuss trimming the hedges, even though they were already immaculate. I spent the day with him, hoping my presence would ease his agitation. We talked about trivial things, books, the weather. But he always circled back to Daisy. "Do you think she's all right?" he asked me at one point, his voice tinged with desperation. "She's fine," I lied, though I had no way of knowing. "She just needs time." He nodded, but his expression didn't change. As the afternoon wore on, the house grew quiet. Even the air seemed to still, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Gatsby suggested we go for a swim, though I could tell his heart wasn't in it. He hadn't used the pool all summer, but now, with autumn approaching, he seemed determined to enjoy it at least once before the season changed. "I'll take a swim and then have a nap," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Maybe after that, she'll call." I watched as he changed into his bathing suit and strode out to the pool. The water shimmered in the afternoon light, a perfect blue that seemed almost unreal. Meanwhile, in the Valley of Ashes, George Wilson was unraveling, consumed by grief and rage. He had spent the night piecing together fragments of information about Myrtle's death. He had learned about the yellow car, the same one he had seen speeding away from the scene. And Tom, ever the opportunist, had pointed him squarely in Gatsby's direction. "He's the one you're looking for," Tom had said with a smirk. "That yellow car belongs to him." George didn't hesitate. Armed with a revolver and a heart full of vengeance, he set out for West Egg. I was inside Gatsby's house when I heard the shot. The sound shattered the stillness, reverberating through the empty halls. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then came the second shot, and I knew. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and saw Gatsby's body floating in the pool. The water, once so pristine, was now stained red, the ripples spreading outward in slow, mournful waves. George Wilson lay on the grass nearby, the revolver still clutched in his hand. He had taken his own life after exacting his revenge. The scene felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. It wasn't until the staff began to emerge from the house, their faces pale with shock. I realized the full weight of what had happened. Gatsby was dead. The man who had built an empire, who had spent his life chasing a dream, was gone. And the dream, too, had died with him. The days that followed were a blur. I took it upon myself to arrange Gatsby's funeral, though I quickly discovered that the man who had filled his house with hundreds of partygoers every weekend was, in death, nearly friendless. None of the socialites, politicians, or celebrities who had flocked to his party showed up. Even Daisy and Tom were conspicuously absent, having left town without so much as a word. In the end, it was just me, a few of Gatsby's servants, and his father, a quiet, unassuming man who arrived from the Midwest with an air of bewildered grief. He spoke proudly of his son, showing me a tattered photograph of Gatsby's mansion that he had kept in his wallet. It was clear that he hadn't understood the full scope of his son's life, but he loved him nonetheless. As I stood by the grave, listening to the priest's somber words, I felt a deep, aching sadness. Gatsby had been many things: a dreamer, a liar, a romantic, but above all, he had been a man who believed in the impossible. He had reached for the stars, and though he had fallen short, his faith in the dream had been unwavering. That night, back at my bungalow, I sat on the porch and stared across the bay at the green light on Daisy's dock.